He left her for power and another woman, but 3 years later, in a crowded hotel lobby, he saw a little girl with his own eyes staring back at him. 3 years earlier, Ryan Collins had stood at the top of his world and convinced himself he was making the most rational decision of his life. At only 32, he was already the CEO of a rapidly growing corporation, a man with investors chasing after him, with journalists writing glowing profiles about his ambition and brilliance, with employees who admired and feared him in equal measure. Yet in the quiet hours, when the spotlight dimmed and the noise of meetings and deals faded, his thoughts had always turned to Emily. She was not from his world of boardrooms and contracts. She worked as a photographer, someone who saw life through a lens rather than financial charts, and she had a way of pulling him down from the clouds into something real and grounding. With her, he laughed without calculation, spoke without rehearsing, and felt human rather than a title. She had brown hair that shimmered auburn under the sun, and eyes so intensely blue that he often told her they were the only color that could silence his restless mind. But when Victoria entered the scene, everything shifted. She was the daughter of a powerful business magnate, a woman who carried influence the way others carried handbags, effortlessly and with devastating effect. At galas she sparkled, at conferences she was always in the center of the room, and when she set her eyes on Ryan, she did so with intent. To him, she presented a partnership that went far beyond romance. Merging their lives meant merging empires, connecting his rising company to her family's vast network of wealth and political clout. Every advisor around him whispered that it was a move he could not afford to ignore. Marrying Victoria would secure the kind of stability most men in his position could only dream about. Emily felt it long before he admitted it. She watched him grow distant, not because he loved her less but because he was measuring himself against the expectations of the world he had built. He would return home late, distracted, his phone always buzzing with messages he wouldn't let her see. She asked him once, quietly, if he was happy. He kissed her forehead, avoided her gaze, and told her he was fine, but the lie trembled between them like glass about to shatter. In her heart she already knew she was losing him, not to another woman's beauty but to ambition wearing a human face. When the choice finally came, it was brutal in its simplicity. Ryan told her he had to think of the future, that love wasn't enough to build the empire he envisioned, that marrying Victoria was not betrayal but strategy. The words burned his tongue even as he said them, but he forced them out, convincing himself he was acting with discipline, with foresight, with the cold clarity of a leader. Emily didn't cry. She didn't beg. She listened, her face pale, her hands trembling only once as she folded the letter she had been writing to him, words of encouragement and devotion that no longer mattered. She placed it on the table, whispered that she wished him happiness even if it wasn't with her, and walked away with her shoulders straight though her heart was breaking. That night, Ryan sat in his penthouse staring at the glittering skyline, surrounded by silence more suffocating than any crowded boardroom. He told himself he had done the right thing, that Emily was a chapter of his life that belonged to a different man, a weaker man who dreamed instead of conquered. But when he closed his eyes, he could still see her face, could still hear her voice calling his name in the darkness, and it left a hollow echo inside him that even the applause of success could not fill. Emily left without a scene, without shouting or throwing accusations, because she knew there was no point in fighting for a man who had already convinced himself that walking away was noble. She packed her few belongings into a suitcase, tucked away photographs and keepsakes that once meant something, and moved out of the apartment they had shared as if erasing herself from his world would somehow make the pain easier to bear. In truth, it didn't. The nights were long, the silence heavy, and there were moments when she wanted nothing more than to call him, to plead with him to remember the life they had dreamed of together, but her pride and her wounded heart kept her still. She told herself she deserved more than being the woman left behind for the sake of a business deal, even if part of her still loved him with every breath. It was only weeks later, when the nausea began to overwhelm her and exhaustion pulled her down at odd hours of the day, that she realized her body carried a secret too powerful to ignore. The doctor confirmed what her instincts already whispered: she was pregnant. She sat in the small clinic, staring at the blurred black and white image on the monitor, and her heart clenched with a mixture of fear and overwhelming tenderness. The child growing inside her was not just hers. It was his. Ryan's. The man who had broken her, the man she still loved, the man who would never know because she could not bring herself to disturb the life he had chosen. She imagined telling him, imagined the shock in his face, perhaps even the regret, but she also imagined Victoria's triumphant smile and the way the world would see her confession, as desperate, manipulative, an attempt to pull him back. That thought sealed her silence. She would not beg for a place in his life, even if it meant raising the child alone. The pregnancy was difficult, not in medical terms but in the weight of loneliness. Emily worked as much as she could, saving every penny, forcing herself to stay strong when her body ached and her emotions threatened to drown her. She painted the nursery herself, soft pastel colors that made the small room glow with warmth, and each stroke of the brush was both a promise and a prayer that she could do this on her own. When Sophia was born, with her golden curls and eyes so piercingly blue they nearly stole Emily's breath, she felt both broken and whole at once. The first cry filled the sterile hospital room, and in that sound Emily found her reason to keep going, even on the darkest days. The years that followed were not easy. Emily learned to juggle late-night feedings with freelance photography jobs, to soothe a fever while answering clients' emails, to smile when she wanted to collapse. She took Sophia to the park, to the library, to little cafes where she could sip coffee while her daughter colored on napkins with crayons. People often stopped her to admire the child's beauty, and every time someone commented on Sophia's eyes, Emily's heart tightened. They were Ryan's eyes, undeniable, a constant reminder of the man she had lost and the choice he had made. Yet she never spoke his name to her daughter, never allowed bitterness to poison the bond between them. Instead, she told Sophia that her father was far away, that life had simply written a different story for them, and that love could still be found in the simplest moments of laughter and closeness. At night, when Sophia slept curled against her, Emily would allow herself to dream of what might have been if Ryan had chosen differently. She imagined him holding their child, reading her bedtime stories, carrying her on his shoulders through crowded streets. She imagined the life they could have built, not one of boardrooms and alliances, but of shared mornings, whispered secrets, and the quiet certainty of family. But those dreams were always fleeting, because Emily knew she had no right to linger in the past. She had to live for the future, for Sophia, and for the strength she had discovered inside herself. Ryan's life with Victoria unfolded exactly as the world expected it to, yet never in the way his heart longed for. Their marriage was a performance, a carefully orchestrated union designed for cameras, shareholders, and political circles, not for love. They hosted galas in their mansion where laughter sounded like crystal glasses clinking but never reached his soul, and they vacationed in places so luxurious they looked like paintings, though Ryan often felt like an imposter standing in the frame. Victoria played her role flawlessly, her blonde hair gleamed under chandeliers, her smile was polished and perfect, her hand always gracefully resting on his arm as though she owned it, and perhaps she did. But in the moments when the parties ended and the doors closed, silence hung between them, heavy and unbreakable. She spoke of connections, of alliances, of business ventures. He nodded, agreeing where necessary, but inside, he was haunted by a hollow ache that no amount of success could erase. Every morning Ryan woke in sheets that smelled faintly of expensive perfume, yet he missed the simple scent of Emily's hair against his shoulder. He remembered the way she used to wake before him, brushing her fingers gently through his hair as though he were a man, not a CEO, and how she whispered dreams for their future with a warmth that needed no audience. Those memories were both comfort and torment. In the daylight he silenced them with work, diving into endless meetings, flying to foreign cities, shaking hands with leaders whose eyes carried the same hunger as his own. But when he returned home, the emptiness sharpened. Victoria never asked how his day truly was. She wanted figures, projections, outcomes, and he gave them to her because it was what she had married him for. Meanwhile, Emily's life was different in every possible way, yet infinitely more alive. Her apartment was modest, its walls decorated not with rare art but with the drawings of her little girl, Sophia. There were mornings filled with spilled cereal and laughter, afternoons in the park chasing butterflies, evenings spent reading picture books aloud until her voice grew hoarse. She struggled constantly, juggling bills, working late on photography projects, worrying about daycare fees, but within her struggles there was meaning. Sophia's tiny arms around her neck, the way the child's laughter filled every corner of their home, gave Emily a sense of purpose that no amount of wealth could have granted. She carried exhaustion in her body, but love gave her strength. Sophia grew into a child whose presence turned heads. Her curls shone like spun gold, her cheeks were kissed by sunlight, and her eyes, those piercing, unmistakable blue eyes, captured the attention of strangers. People often remarked that she looked like an angel, but to Emily she looked like Ryan, and that resemblance pierced her every day. In those moments she fought a storm of emotions, longing, grief, resentment, and above all, the unshakable truth that part of Ryan lived on in their daughter. Emily never spoke of him, never poisoned Sophia's heart with stories of betrayal. Instead, she nurtured curiosity with gentle answers, telling her daughter that her father was far away, a good man she might meet someday. She wanted Sophia to grow with love in her heart, not bitterness, and though it hurt, she carried that burden silently. The contrast between Ryan's glittering cage and Emily's humble yet vibrant world could not have been greater. He lived surrounded by wealth but starved for meaning, while she lived in constant struggle but fed by the boundless joy of raising a child. He walked through rooms filled with people yet felt alone, while she, though alone, never felt empty because Sophia filled every void. And while Ryan told himself he had chosen wisely, aligning with Victoria's power to secure his empire, in the deepest corners of his soul he began to question whether the cost had been too high. He did not know it yet, but life was preparing to confront him with the truth in the most unexpected and irreversible way. The hotel ballroom was alive with the kind of energy Ryan had grown used to but never truly embraced. Crystal chandeliers spilled light over white tablecloths, conversations mingled with the notes of a string quartet, and the air was thick with perfume and ambition. He moved through the crowd with Victoria by his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her laughter bright but hollow, rehearsed for those who listened. She thrived in such settings, glowing under the admiration of investors, politicians, and society wives, while Ryan performed his role as the confident CEO, exchanging firm handshakes and carefully chosen words. To everyone else he looked like a man who had everything, yet inside he was weary, his soul restless in the cage of perfection he had built. It happened when he turned to glance across the room, his gaze drifting over strangers and colleagues until it stopped, frozen, as if time itself had stumbled. By the fountain, near the corner where the crowd thinned, stood Emily. She hadn't changed so much that he couldn't recognize her, but she had grown into a quieter strength. Her brown hair cascaded down her shoulders, her figure wrapped in a simple but elegant dress that made her look radiant without effort. She wasn't laughing, she wasn't surrounded by admirers, she simply stood there, composed, as though the chaos of the ballroom belonged to another world. And in her arms, cradled with a tenderness that pierced him, was a little girl. At first Ryan couldn't breathe. He thought his eyes deceived him, that the wine in his glass had clouded his senses. But then the child turned, golden curls catching the light, and he saw her face. A tiny reflection of himself, softened by Emily's warmth but unmistakably his. Those blue eyes, his eyes, looked up at Emily with innocent trust, and the ground beneath him shifted. His chest tightened, his heart slamming so hard he wondered if anyone could hear it. The ballroom noise receded until there was nothing but the sound of blood rushing in his ears. Victoria's voice tried to pull him back, something about a business partner approaching, a name he was expected to remember, but her words dissolved in the air. He could not move, could not speak, trapped in the gravity of that moment. Emily had noticed him now, her gaze steady, calm in a way that stung more than anger ever could. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She simply held her daughter closer, as if bracing for the storm she knew was inevitable. Ryan felt 100 impulses surge through him at once. He wanted to cross the room, to demand answers, to touch the child's cheek and confirm what his heart already screamed was true. But his feet refused him. Fear, guilt, shock, they tangled around him until he stood like a statue in a suit, outwardly composed, inwardly collapsing. His mind replayed every moment of the past 3 years, the night he let Emily go, the silence that followed, the emptiness he carried like a shadow. Now he understood. He hadn't just lost her, he had lost a part of himself, and it had been living in her arms all along. When the evening finally dragged itself to a close, Ryan could barely remember the speeches he gave, the hands he shook, the smiles he forced. He felt like he was moving through water, heavy and blurred, every nerve straining toward the image of Emily and the child who mirrored him. In the quiet of his suite later that night, he stood at the window overlooking the glittering city and pressed his palms to the glass as though it could anchor him. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't even close his eyes without seeing them. And in the hours before dawn, one thought consumed him, sharper than any boardroom battle, louder than any applause he had ever received: he had a daughter, and he had been living in ignorance. The truth had arrived like lightning, destroying the facade he had spent years building, and nothing would ever be the same again. Ryan did not sleep a single minute after the gala. He lay in the darkness of the hotel suite with Victoria beside him, her breathing steady, her body turned away, while his thoughts clawed at him with merciless clarity. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's face, no longer the young woman he had left behind but someone stronger, steadier, with a quiet dignity that unsettled him. And then there was the child, the little girl with golden hair and blue eyes so identical to his that denial was impossible. The image burned through him until dawn broke, and with it came a decision he had been too afraid to make the night before. He had to find her. He had to know the truth, spoken not by suspicion or a haunting resemblance but by her lips, steady and undeniable. The next morning, Ryan sent Victoria off with some excuse about meetings, ignoring the frost in her gaze. He drove himself through the city like a man possessed, following the trail of connections, old addresses, and instinct until finally he stood in front of a modest townhouse, so far from the marble and glass of his own world that it felt like crossing into another life. He lingered at the doorstep longer than he should have, his heart thundering in his chest, his hand trembling when he finally raised it to knock. For a moment he wished she would not answer, that the truth would remain hidden behind the wooden door. But then it opened, and Emily stood before him. She did not look surprised. If anything, her eyes carried the calm of someone who had expected this day and prepared herself for it. She wore no mask of anger, no show of fear, only a guarded stillness that shook him more than fury ever could. Behind her, he glimpsed a child's shoes near the door, drawings tacked onto the wall, the unmistakable signs of a home built with love and sacrifice. His throat tightened, the words threatening to strangle him, but finally he managed to speak. "Is she mine?" The question emerged like a plea, raw and broken. Emily's gaze didn't waver. Her silence stretched between them, forcing him to feel every second of the years he had lost, every bedtime story unsaid, every scraped knee he had not bandaged. Finally she nodded. "Yes. She's your daughter." Her voice was calm, steady, but it carried a weight heavier than any accusation. Ryan staggered back as if struck. His breath caught, his hands trembling at his sides. He wanted to rage, to collapse, to fall to his knees and beg forgiveness, but all he could do was whisper, "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily's expression shifted, the faintest trace of pain flickering across her face, but she didn't look away. "Because you made your choice. You chose her. You chose the business, the power, the future you thought you needed. I wasn't going to force myself into that world, not for me and not for her. I wasn't going to beg for a place in your life when you had already shut the door." Her words cut through him with more precision than any argument could. He realized then that his silence, his cowardice, had stolen not just years from Emily but from his own daughter, and no amount of wealth or status could buy them back. Inside the house he could hear a small voice calling out, the sound of a child stirring. Ryan's entire body ached with the instinct to step inside, to see her, to touch her, but Emily's posture told him he wasn't yet allowed. She stood between him and that world, a guardian who had carried everything alone while he had lived behind glass walls of ambition. He bowed his head, fighting to control the storm of emotions that threatened to undo him. Shame burned hot in his chest, guilt gnawed at his gut, and yet beneath it all was something terrifying in its intensity: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Emily finally spoke again, her voice quieter now but still firm. "I never lied to you. I never hid her to hurt you. I simply protected us. You left, Ryan, and I learned how to live without you." She stepped back slightly, not in invitation but in conclusion, as if her words were the final barrier she needed to place between them. Ryan nodded slowly, his eyes stinging with unshed tears he had never allowed himself before. "I was blind," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I thought I was making the right choice. I thought love wasn't enough. But I see her, and I know I've been living a lie." He turned away then, because he couldn't bear to unravel completely in front of her. He walked down the steps like a man exiled, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. On the drive back, he saw Victoria waiting at the house, her silhouette framed in the window, and for the first time he looked at her with clarity rather than habit. The life he had built with her was a prison forged from ambition and cowardice. Now the bars had shattered, and though what lay beyond terrified him, he knew there was no going back. That night, Ryan lay awake again, staring at the ceiling of a house that no longer felt like his own. The truth had changed everything. He was not just a man, not just a husband to a woman he could never love, not just a CEO bound to an empire. He was a father. And the thought consumed him with a force so undeniable that he knew his life would never again be measured in contracts and profits, but in whether he had the courage to fight for the family he had once thrown away. The days that followed were a storm that spread from behind closed doors into the full glare of the public eye. Ryan had lived long enough under the scrutiny of business journals and society columns to know what it meant when whispers became headlines, but nothing had prepared him for the ferocity with which the story of his unraveling marriage with Victoria consumed the press. She was not a woman accustomed to losing, and when she realized that his determination to leave her was not another one of their cyclical arguments but a decision carved into stone, she unleashed every weapon at her disposal. She wept in front of cameras, she accused him of betrayal in interviews, she played the part of the perfect wife abandoned without reason, and for a time the world lapped it up. But cracks appeared quickly, because truth always finds a way to seep through even the most carefully constructed lies. Business associates whispered of her ruthless manipulations, old acquaintances recalled her calculated charm, and soon the sympathy she tried to summon curdled into suspicion. Ryan watched it all with a kind of detached numbness, no longer caring about the gossip pages or the speculation, because for the first time in years the cage around him had opened, and the only thing that mattered was what lay outside of it. The legal battle was vicious. Victoria fought not for love, which had never existed between them, but for control, for money, for the satisfaction of leaving scars that might outlast her presence. Courtrooms became stages where her voice rose and broke, where lawyers argued over assets and reputations, where Ryan sat in silence and let the storm rage because he no longer felt the need to defend a life that had already crumbled. His only fear was not of losing fortune or influence but of losing the fragile chance he had glimpsed in Emily's eyes when she had admitted the truth about Sophia. At night, when he left the suffocating halls of litigation, he would drive aimlessly through the city before inevitably finding himself near Emily's neighborhood, sometimes parking far enough away that he could not be seen, staring at the faint light in her windows and imagining the ordinary domesticity he had traded away. He thought of her reading to their daughter, tucking her into bed, soothing nightmares, and every image burned through him with both longing and shame. When the divorce was finalized and Victoria finally lost her grip, the release was not triumphant but quiet. Ryan signed the final documents with hands that trembled, not from fear but from the enormity of what it meant. For years he had played the role of a husband in a union without love, convincing himself that duty and ambition justified the emptiness in his chest. Now he was free, but freedom came with its own burden. He knew he could not simply step into Emily's world and expect forgiveness or acceptance. He had forfeited that right long ago. All he could do was show her that he had changed, not with promises or apologies but with persistence, patience, and the willingness to bear rejection if that was all she had to give. At first Emily kept her distance, her tone polite but firm when he asked to see Sophia. She made it clear that his place in their daughter's life would not be given lightly, that trust had to be earned not with grand gestures but with consistent presence. Ryan accepted her terms, even when it stung. He arrived humbly, sometimes standing on her doorstep with nothing more than a book he thought Sophia might like or a small toy he had chosen after walking the aisles of a store in confusion, trying to imagine what would bring a smile to her face. The first visits were awkward. Sophia was shy, clinging to Emily's leg, peeking at him with wide eyes as if trying to decide what to make of this stranger who looked so much like her. Ryan felt clumsy, unsure of how to hold her, how to speak in a voice gentle enough to bridge the distance between them, but slowly, with time, her hesitation faded. One afternoon in the park marked a turning point. Sophia ran ahead, her curls bouncing as she laughed, and Ryan followed, his heart thundering with fear that she might fall, that he might fail her in some way he couldn't yet anticipate. She tripped on the edge of the path and scraped her knee, and before Emily could move, Ryan was already there, lifting her gently, whispering comfort with words he didn't know he remembered, brushing the dirt from her skin and holding her close until her tears gave way to hiccups and giggles. Emily watched them, her eyes softening against her will, and in that moment Ryan felt a sliver of redemption. He wasn't forgiven, not yet, but he was being allowed to try. The weeks became months, and the rhythm of his visits wove itself into the fabric of their lives. He learned to braid hair with clumsy fingers until Sophia declared he was getting better. He built lopsided Lego castles that collapsed only for them to rebuild together. He read bedtime stories in a voice that grew steadier with practice. Every evening he spent with her was both a joy and a torment, because each moment was precious yet underscored by the knowledge of all the years he had missed. Emily, cautious but fair, began to relax her guard. She saw the sincerity in his efforts, the way he never missed a visit, never grew impatient, never tried to buy their affection with wealth. What he offered instead was presence, humility, and the gradual shaping of himself into a father she could believe in. The scandal of the divorce eventually faded, replaced by new headlines, new scandals, new distractions for the world. But for Ryan, the real story was not what people wrote in magazines but the quiet transformation happening in the corners of a modest home where laughter echoed, where the walls were lined with children's drawings instead of expensive art, where the air carried the smell of pancakes instead of perfume. He realized he had spent years chasing applause that meant nothing, when the sound of his daughter's laughter was the only ovation he had ever truly needed. And as he walked her to the park one late afternoon, her small hand gripping his tightly, he understood that the life he was building now was not a second act but the beginning of something entirely new, fragile and uncertain but more real than anything he had known before. Sophia, as she had been named, welcomed Ryan into her life with the natural innocence only a child could possess. At first her curiosity was quiet, her glances hesitant, her little hand clinging to Emily's whenever he entered the room, but children have a way of seeing past what adults cannot. It was as if some part of her already recognized him, not just in the color of his eyes that mirrored her own but in the unspoken bond that connected them. Slowly, the walls of shyness gave way to laughter, and soon she was tugging at his arm, asking him to build towers, to play pretend, to braid her doll's hair. Ryan, who had once signed contracts worth millions with steady confidence, found his hands trembling as he clumsily tied ribbons into her curls, only to be met with peals of laughter and the proud declaration that he was getting better. Those moments, ordinary to anyone else, carried the weight of miracles for him. Evenings became his most treasured hours. Sophia would climb onto his lap with a book nearly too heavy for her small arms, demanding that he read it again and again until the words lodged themselves in his mind. At first his voice was too formal, too flat, but under her expectant gaze he softened, experimenting with silly tones and dramatic pauses that made her giggle until she pressed her face into his chest. He learned that what mattered was not the story itself but the steadiness of his presence, the warmth of his arms around her, the reassurance that he would still be there when the last page was turned. Nights that had once stretched endlessly in the sterile quiet of his mansion were now filled with the comforting sound of a child's breathing as she drifted off to sleep with her hand curled around his finger. Emily observed all of this from a careful distance. Her heart had been hardened by years of solitude and disappointment, and she did not allow herself the luxury of quick forgiveness. She watched him struggle through the simple routines she had long since mastered on her own, saw the frustration cross his face when he failed at something as small as fastening a stubborn button on Sophia's jacket, and yet he never quit, never walked away, never let his pride interfere with the fragile steps he was taking toward fatherhood. It was in those small acts of humility that Emily's resolve began to crack. She saw a man who was not trying to buy his way into their lives with gifts or grand promises but one who was learning to bend, to adapt, to prove through patience and persistence that he was more than the shadow who had abandoned them. There were still nights when Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering the pain of his betrayal and wondering if she was a fool to allow him back into their lives. The scars of the past whispered warnings in her ear, telling her that he had chosen ambition once and could choose it again. But then she would recall the sight of Sophia perched on his shoulders in the park, her laughter ringing out as he ran clumsily through the grass, or the way his eyes softened when she fell asleep against his chest, and doubt was replaced by something quieter, something she dared not yet name but could no longer ignore. For Ryan, the transformation was relentless and consuming. Each day with Sophia taught him more about himself than years of boardrooms and business victories ever had. He learned that love was not a grand declaration but a series of small, consistent choices, showing up even when exhausted, listening to her endless stream of questions about the world, kneeling in the dirt to help her plant flowers she insisted would grow faster if he whispered to them. He found joy in tasks he once would have dismissed as trivial, like cooking pancakes in the morning or drawing pictures with crayons that left his fingers stained with color. And though he still carried the weight of regret for the years lost, the laughter of his daughter began to heal wounds he thought would never close. Emily saw the change not only in how he treated Sophia but in how he carried himself. His shoulders, once rigid with the burden of expectation, seemed lighter, his eyes less haunted, his smile unpracticed but genuine. He spoke less about deals and more about moments, less about the future he wanted to build in terms of profit and more about the present he was grateful to share. She realized with growing clarity that he was no longer the man who had walked away in pursuit of power, he was someone else, someone still flawed but willing to learn, to stumble, to fight for a place not in the world's spotlight but in the quiet intimacy of family life. As months passed, Sophia's attachment to him grew unshakable. She began to ask when he was coming back before he had even left, her eyes lighting up at the sound of his car pulling into the street. She introduced him proudly to her friends at the playground, declaring him her daddy with the certainty only a child could have. For Ryan, every one of those moments was both a gift and a reminder of what he had nearly destroyed. He cherished them fiercely, determined never again to let ambition or fear blind him to the only legacy that mattered. And though Emily did not say it aloud, though she kept her heart guarded, there were times when he caught her watching him with an expression that told him words were no longer necessary. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something even more fragile and powerful, the beginning of trust, slowly being rebuilt one moment at a time. And Ryan knew that if he could protect that fragile trust, if he could nurture it with the same devotion he now gave to Sophia, then perhaps, someday, what was broken between him and Emily might not only be repaired but reborn into something stronger than it had ever been before. The morning of Sophia's preschool graduation dawned with sunlight spilling through thin curtains, and Ryan found himself standing in front of the mirror adjusting a tie he rarely wore outside of business meetings. It was different now, though. This wasn't for investors or reporters or board members, this was for his daughter, who had spent the last week telling him again and again that he had to look handsome like a real daddy when she walked across the stage. The words had touched him in ways he couldn't explain, a mixture of joy and guilt and pride that left him standing frozen in front of his reflection for longer than he meant to. He had missed so many milestones, her first steps, her first words, her first birthdays, but he would not miss this. Not anymore. When he arrived at Emily's house to pick them up, he was greeted by the sight of Sophia spinning clumsily in her small white dress, a paper crown she had made herself already slipping sideways on her head. She ran to him with uncontained excitement, arms flung wide, and he scooped her up as her laughter filled the hallway. Emily stood nearby, her expression calm but softened, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, dressed simply yet with an elegance that struck him with a force more powerful than any memory. For a moment he thought of how many years he had let slip through his fingers, of how many mornings like this one he could have shared, and it nearly brought him to his knees. Instead, he steadied himself, adjusting Sophia's crown while murmuring that she looked like a princess, and when Emily's eyes met his, there was no bitterness there, only a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had all come. The school auditorium was crowded with parents, the air alive with chatter, the stage decorated with balloons and banners unevenly taped to the wall. Ryan felt out of place at first, as though everyone could see straight through him, could see the years of absence and mistakes written across his face. But when Sophia spotted him in the crowd and waved with both hands, her face lighting up with pure joy, all the tension drained away. In that moment, it didn't matter what the world thought, only what she saw, and she saw her father. When her name was called, she walked across the stage with determined little steps, clutching her certificate as though it were a treasure, and Ryan felt his throat tighten with emotion so sharp it nearly choked him. He had closed deals worth billions without flinching, but watching his daughter hold a piece of paper decorated with stickers made him feel as if he had just witnessed the greatest triumph of his life. After the ceremony, the three of them lingered outside in the warm afternoon air, Sophia bouncing between them, eager to show off her certificate to anyone who would look. Ryan carried her on his shoulders while Emily walked beside them, her hand occasionally brushing against his as Sophia shifted above. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic gesture, but the simplicity of it, a family walking together, laughing together, struck Ryan with more power than any victory he had ever claimed. He thought of how different it all could have been, how close he had come to losing this forever, and the realization filled him with both gratitude and determination. Later that evening, when Sophia finally collapsed into sleep, her crown lying forgotten on the nightstand and her certificate tucked carefully beside her bed, Ryan and Emily found themselves on the porch in the quiet of the fading day. The air smelled of grass and distant rain, and for a long time they sat in silence, each lost in thought. Finally, Ryan turned to her, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years. He told her that he didn't want to waste any more time, that he wanted to build something lasting, not out of ambition or obligation but out of love and the truth they had fought so hard to reclaim. He suggested a weekend away, a simple trip to the mountains where they could leave behind the noise of the city and give Sophia memories filled with laughter, nature, and peace. Emily studied him for a long moment, her gaze sharp but no longer guarded, and then she smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She said yes. For Ryan, that yes meant more than any contract he had ever signed. It wasn't just permission for a trip, it was an opening, a signal that the walls Emily had built to protect herself were finally softening. He felt a warmth spread through him, not the fleeting satisfaction of a deal won but the enduring peace of belonging. In that moment he realized that home was not a place, not the sprawling mansion he had once lived in, not the office towers that bore his company's name, but the people beside him now, the woman whose strength had carried what he had abandoned, and the child who had welcomed him without question into her world. The years of pain and betrayal had not vanished, nor could they. They would always be a part of their story, etched into the foundation of who they were. But as Ryan looked at Emily in the soft twilight, her hair catching the last light of day, he understood that brokenness did not mean ending. Sometimes it meant beginning again, with deeper roots and stronger walls built from the lessons of the past. And as he reached for her hand, feeling her fingers rest lightly in his, he knew that what they were creating was not perfect but real. For the first time in years, he felt unafraid of the future. He was not walking alone anymore.